BC government has stopped talking about stopping the pipeline, and instead they're talking about ensuring that it meets high standards.
Good afternoon. I'm Colleen Christie. Thanks for joining us. We begin with breaking news. The new NDP government is acting on a key plank in its election platform. In a news conference held just a while ago, they outlined their plans to stop the Kinder Morgan Trans Mountain Pipeline expansion project.
Alberta's economy is under attack. The new Green NDP government in British Columbia has announced that it's going to be spending millions of tax dollars to hire lawyers to sue in order to block the approved Kinder Morgan Trans Mountain Pipeline. A bit of background on this. For 6 decades, we've had an energy pipeline running from Edmonton to Burnaby. If it weren't for that pipeline, the economy of BC's Lower Mainland would pretty much grind to a halt overnight. It has been the major source of energy to southern British Columbia for over 50 years. Now, Kinder Morgan is proposing to create a twinned pipeline along the same route using the most modern tech and safest technology. This proposal has been approved by the National Energy Board using the highest environmental standards in the world after exhaustive technical and scientific analysis, consultation with all of the communities, including the First Nations, along the pipeline route, most of whom support this project because they see it as an opportunity to move from poverty to prosperity. But that's not good enough for the ideologues in the BC Green and NDP parties. But the real question is, what is our NDP government in Alberta doing about this? Well, Premier Notley went down to Vancouver a few months back, supposedly to promote support for this twinned pipeline. But she didn't do a single speech, not one interview. She had a few backroom meetings in downtown Vancouver and came back. Now, the then NDP opposition leader, the new NDP Premier, John Horgan, has said that at the meeting he had with Premier Notley, she didn't even try to persuade him, in his own words. So what the heck was she doing? Now, we do know that Premier Notley and the NDP keeps telling us that their huge carbon tax on Alberta is supposed to generate this magical social license to produce approval for pipelines in BC and elsewhere. How's that working out? Every single opponent of these pipelines, including their comrades in British Columbia, the NDP and Green parties, who were opposed to these pipelines before, are still opposed 9 months after the NDP imposed its job-killing carbon tax. So none of this is working. So we need to send a very clear message to Premier Horgan and the British Columbia NDP that Alberta will not take this lying down. We will stand up and defend our legal rights, our economic interests. This is about more than merely some pipeline. This is about whether or not Canada is a country governed by the rule of law and whether or not we are an economic union. There are bigger principles at play. The national economic interest is at stake here. And so my commitment to you is that if I have the honor of serving as Alberta's Premier, I will ensure that we vigorously defend and assert Alberta's economic interests against this kind of anti-growth obstructionism coming from the Greens and New Democrats in BC and elsewhere. That means we will use every tool in the toolkit, including, as necessary, repercussions against any BC government that stands in the way of the rule of law and stands in the way of a project that will create thousands of jobs and tens of billions of dollars of wealth. British Columbia depends on trading with us. They export things to Alberta, including hydropower. They buy and are dependent upon much of the oil and gas that we ship them. There are many ways in which we can creatively assert Alberta's interests, but we need an Alberta government willing to do so, just like the Lougheed government did against a federal government that harmed our energy industry back in the 1980s. So it's time for an Alberta government that stands up for this province. One of the reasons that we need experienced leadership on day one following the next election.